session 2. So this is episode 2 for at least season 2, because Dave, you did an interview with us in season 1 here, but episode 2 of kind of this 4-part series where we're getting into business, doing a little bit of a deep dive, and going, what are some insights that founders can gain, and how to really make a difference in their organization early on. At least the first couple of episodes here are early on. So last time we talked about, and what do you need to get right beforehand? We talked about exits and that kind of stuff, and maybe planning. For this one, specifically what I want to ask you, and this is going to be my first question for you, Dave, is what do founders need to get right early on as almost preventative maintenance? Like if you know you're going to grow, that's the goal, that's what you're going to be doing. What do you need to get right early on so that you're set up for success, rather than having kind of cracks become large caverns or large problems in the future?
Yeah. So last time we talked a little bit about, start with the end in mind. I mentioned titles aren't free, right skill for the right job. A lot of those things are fairly obvious. It's just, helping people get a sense of how to get things started in the beginning, some, minimal work that can be done to get maximum output later on, and also kind of thinking to the future. And when we start talking about, okay, the business is now operating, it's growing, the owner is seeing success, or the founder is seeing success, what are the common kind of things that start to trip them up when that was the case? And I really thought about it, and I think there's sort of 3 things. And I don't know if owners and founders are going to like to hear this, but a lot of it is centered around them, their behaviors, and some of the things that they do when the business is smaller that they definitely need to start thinking about making some slight changes to as the business gets larger. I think the number one thing, and stop me to ask questions, is often the owner founder becomes bottlenecks in decisions. And I have a great example of a behavior that was difficult for a business we were involved in when I was back in the private equity space. So we had invested in a small company. They were doing about $4.5 million a year of revenue when we invested, and they were heading towards a path of about $12 million a year of revenue. And I would meet with the CEO, president regularly, to talk about the business and whatnot. And I remember one day I went into his office, and he had this big stamp, and there was a pile of paper in front of him. And, we were talking, and he was like stamping paper, scribbling, stamping and scribbling. And I was like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm approving invoices. And the stack was about this tall. Like, it was not a short stack of paper. And I was like, why? And he's like, well, I want to see how every dime in this business is spent, and I want to make sure that I'm approving every invoice, because, then I know exactly where every cent is going. Right. And I thought about that for a minute, and I was like, okay, if, he does this on, a weekly or a monthly basis, and it takes him 2 hours every single time, that's 2 hours spent on something that, is a really low value activity to the business. Right. So there's an example. Like, there were probably hundreds of invoices that were sitting on his desk for however long, that required his stamp of approval before they could even get processed by his finance team. So I think that's the thing. It's an example of what are you spending your time on, right? What can you delegate? Why are you doing the things you're doing? Because, when you're the sole person in the business, or it's you and a couple of employees, you spend time doing these things, they add value, they're necessary. But as the business grows, what can you stop doing that doesn't add any value to the business? I would say that's one of the number one things I've noticed.
Okay, so going back to this specific example, what was your advice to this gentleman? Like, what were you saying? Because obviously, again, we want to know what's going on in our business, but you can usually check with a few numbers to check in on that in a different way. So what was your suggestion?
Well, yeah, exactly that, right? My suggestion was, I understand why you're doing this, why you're performing this activity, because it gives you great visibility, but you could still get that visibility without being the bottleneck in the process, right? So, being able to delegate the right kind of authority and responsibility to the people that are actually ordering the services to validate the invoices, as a silly example, right? Before they have to go through this process, right? Making sure that you're getting the information you need to know that the decisions in the business are being made appropriately, having visibility into those things without having to be the person that is the holdup on all of that work. Definitely the advice, I would give that person. And connected to that is you have lots of individuals working for you in your business, and pushing that decision making as far, as close to the customer as possible is critical as a business grows, because as an owner, you're going to be less and less involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, and things will be changing in that business that you may not be aware of, and you definitely need to be able to delegate responsibilities to people that you trust. And so the phrase I use is trust but verify, right? Make the right hiring decision, make sure you're working with people that you can trust, that have demonstrated competency for you, or in previous jobs. Trust them to do the right thing for the business, give them clear direction on whatever they need direction on, and then verify that you're getting the output you need out of that person.
Okay, let's stick with these examples, because I like this example. I go, at different stages of the business, how does the owner step back specifically from seeing what's happening with money? Because money, I'm a control freak too with money. I mean, I want to make sure that no one's stealing anything. I want to make sure that my numbers are accurate. Like that stuff is important to me. So give me maybe a few stages in business about how that bottleneck shows up and how you take care of it, maybe in different ways along the process.
I'd have to think about the different phases. The most successful entrepreneurs I've seen are the ones that, you know, very early on identify what their skill is in the business and spend the majority of their time focusing on that. So in this specific example, the reason why we were interested in investing in this business in the first place was that, the person, when we partnered with him, he was a fantastic salesperson. And that's what enabled the growth of the business. And, when the business was growing, he was able to spend all of his time selling and a minimal amount of time in the office performing administration. And as the business grew, the administration also grew. And now he was spending time doing things that weren't even really his skill set, weren't even his area of expertise. And as a result, the business wouldn't grow as fast, because if you've got, 8, 10, 12 hours in a day that you're spending in your business, you want to be spending as many of those hours as possible doing the thing that you're best at, which is often growing the business, and spending as little time as possible doing the things that, are not in your wheelhouse, or not in your skill set, or just of low value to the business, period.
So maybe I'll ask this in a different way, because I think that I asked a poor question there. Would take this maybe question and play with it. At what point should a business owner hire, and again, specifically with this example, at what point does somebody hire somebody specifically for finances? Like not just accounts receivable, accounts payable, but something more like a CPA, something more like somebody who needs to strategically think about this stuff and then delegate some of this as well. Is there a typical point that you see with the amount of people involved in a business or the amount of revenue? Because one thing I've seen is a ton of successful partnerships. One of the partners is a CPA. And then I see that as really taking care of a business well. So at what point should that take place in a business, in your opinion?
I think the best indicator of that, just from a financial perspective, is when your business is growing substantially and you're starting to struggle with accounts receivable and cash being available to pay for things. At that point in time, that's when you need to seriously look at the expertise in your finance team. Most entrepreneurs are very debt adverse. They don't want to have to talk to their bank about things. Maybe their business is not in a state where they can borrow money in a way that meets the needs of the business, so they tend to run it on cash flow. And that's great, but growing businesses consume cash faster than the cash comes into the business. And then you end up juggling things like payables, right? You're trying to collect from your customers, and you're trying to make your payable commitments, and you're starting to spend more and more and more time on that instead of growing the business. I would say that's a great number one indication. Fast growth businesses always consume cash, always, even if they're wildly successful.
Yeah, and I like that example because it comes back to that first point: is the owner becomes the bottleneck or the founder becomes the bottleneck, right? And that's an exact example of that. Hey, you're trying to juggle these things and you're focusing so much on this that you're not taking care of the sales. You're not taking care of the business growth. Okay. That's beautiful. So again, I appreciate that because it's not as specific as maybe I had asked for it. But it's more helpful because businesses are going to be different. I mean, I have a business that easily does a few $1 million with like 3 employees, whereas a lot of businesses need a lot more employees to generate that first little bit of revenue, right?
Yeah, and it depends on the type of business, right?
Yeah.
If you're a manufacturer, that's a whole different story from being a professional services or a consulting firm, right? But the number one indicator will be fast growth and the constraints it places on finance. For sure, on the finance side, that's when I would start engaging people that are actually professionals in it that have seen it before, right? Because they can help you with those types of conversations. You don't have to teach it to yourself. You can continue doing what you're great at. You can rely on the people with the expertise to do the things you need them to do.
Mm-hmm. So again, one more follow-up question before we move on to example number 2 or situation number 2. And that is how this relates to bottlenecking somewhat. Sometimes in my own business, I don't know how much should I learn about this versus how much should I just step back and allow a professional. There's something nagging in me, and maybe tell me if this is normal or not. But there's something nagging in me where I go, but I should know at least a little bit about this so that I can hire properly, so that I can do things. But is that where you go, Mark? You're becoming the bottleneck with HR. Like, what would you do with a situation like that?
It's almost every entrepreneur, right? Often, especially when it comes to delivery to their customers, there's a sense of perfection that's required there, and there's a sense of needing to know everything and needing to be able to do anything because there's comfort in knowing if I can do every single thing that this business requires and I can do it reasonably well, then I'm a good, well-rounded, owner, CEO, and that always gets you to a point. Like, yes, you need to have a basic understanding of financing, and you need to have a basic understanding of how to read financial statements and make sure that you're building profitable business. But at some point, your expertise is no longer good enough in certain areas of the business that you need to start bringing in that expertise from the outside.
Okay. That's brilliant. Let's go to topic number 2 here. So what is the second thing that you see founders struggling with?
And this one, it's always a sensitive kind of subject for owners because it's information, right? Owners are reluctant to share information. They're often reluctant to, reach down to the front line and ask questions. And so as a result, they end up, with such control over information, the people that are working with them or for them don't get the entire context of something. They don't get critical information downloaded to them. And as a result, they're not able to produce a perfectly optimal result. And similarly, if you're sharing information down, that's also opening up an opportunity for you to receive information from people that are working for you that often will have different perspectives and, different things to contribute. Will ask questions that make you think about things in a little bit different of a way. But it's really difficult for entrepreneurs to kind of get to that point. I was recruited for a role in operations at a business that was doing just under 200 million a year of revenue. And I was responsible for a fairly large contingent of people and spend. And so the first thing I did when I started day one is I reached out to our controller and I said, hey, like, I need to see all the financials of the business for, the last 3 to 5 years, whatever you have. I'd really like to start digging into some of these things. And their response to me was, yeah, no problem, but I just need permission from the owner first. Right. So, executive level person coming into an organization and, ask for information that would be available to that level. It's been available to me in previous roles with similar titles. Being told that it needs to go through the CEO first or the owner first is just an interesting dynamic. And I get it. Right. I mean, people that have started their own businesses don't necessarily want the whole world knowing what their finances are. But when you have people in trusted roles and you're relying on them to run your business for you, you need to give them access to the information that they need to do their job. And I've seen that time and time again is, owners become, or the entrepreneurs become, the people that have all of the information, and they hand it out to folks working for them so sparingly that they're missing out on ideas, solutions, those types of things. And it's just a control thing, right? It's back to the control thing on information.
Both our strength and our weaknesses when we're starting businesses, right? Control as much as possible so you can grow as much as possible and understand what's going on. And yet it becomes, again, coming back to the bottleneck or whatever. If we don't have information from our employees, I think about Concord right now. So Concord with our strat planning, typically, I mean, you know how Dwayne would work. So Dwayne would go into the business and what he does is gathers a crazy amount of information from every level of the business and then says, hey, which of this is legitimate? What do we need to think about? What is consistent here? Like it's simply the more information, the better. And what you're saying here, which I appreciate, is if we control too much information, if we're I don't know if this is a good analogy, but if we're the Coca-Cola and that we've got like this recipe that's hidden somewhere in like a vault behind a vault behind a vault, there's some information that's great to keep proprietary. But if it's lacking or if it's stopping us from communicating and gathering more information from our team, that becomes a problem. So I guess my first follow-up question is, when do we notice that it's becoming a problem? When do we, what can somebody see in their business where they go, you know what, that's probably me?
It's almost always as soon as they start hiring employees with specific purposes or specific roles in the business. That's when I see the communication and information barriers start breaking down. It's like, okay, I'm going to share this with my salesperson, but I'm not going to share that with my accountant because I don't think it's important for them to know. And I'm not going to share, this information with customer service or operations or whatever it is. And so as a result, everybody becomes an expert with a very specific amount of information in their area, but they don't necessarily see how it all ties together. And when you've got that team working for you, it's really important to explain to them, like, hey, this is how the business works. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing. This is your role from my perspective in all of the things we're doing here in this business. Let's talk about that. What don't you understand, right? You're going to create a team environment way more quickly. You're going to get the right kind of ideas way faster. And the other thing is, if people understand how it all fits together, even at the most basic of level, you will get more productivity out of them, and you will have to do less of that day-to-day management of information as well.
So do you think there's a part of this that comes back to some of the things you've already repeated a couple times of knowing what our strengths are and maybe getting confused about what we need to focus on versus what's best for growth? Because my assumption here is that the average person goes, well, yeah, like if I'm in the know and no one else is, I feel important somewhat, is probably a part of it, and go, I can see exactly what's going on that control side. Whereas if as soon as I let go of some of this and allow, I mean, what are directors paid to do? What are C-suite executives paid to do? They're paid to think, right? And if they've got information in front of them, they can think better. If we've put the right people in the right seats, all of a sudden that starts to come together in a different way. And I'm wondering if maybe is it a refocus of somebody saying, hey, listen, if I'm at the head of this, I need to think at a higher level. And for that, I don't need more information. I need specific bits of information from the right people so that I can make better decisions. So what would you do with that statement? Am I way off or?
100% correct. One of my clients currently, family owned business. And the first thing we wanted to start doing was town halls. And, it's not a big business. And so we started just sharing information about the business at town halls. And what you find is when you do that, the questions about what you're doing, what's next, what's happening, they start to diminish from, the teams around you. And you also get these like really awesome opportunities where someone comes to you and says, hey, like you talked about this at the town hall, I have an idea. Or, you said we're like pursuing this type of customer now this year, I know somebody in that industry, who would I introduce them to? Like when you start sharing information about what your business is about and what you're doing and what you're trying to focus on, your team naturally starts to pay attention to that and try to help you out. Because everybody wants to build their career, everybody wants to add value, they want to contribute, right? And so the more you can do that, the better. And obviously, you're not going to share, hey, like this is our profit this year, this is our top line revenue. A lot of companies don't need to share that with team members, but what you can do is share enough about the direction of the business and what you're up to, so that they know what their role is and they know how they can contribute to it.
Hmm. Let's go back to that Coca-Cola example again. What are the things that we do need to control information on? And you're talking about this a little bit, but I'm talking specifically with our team, or even with directors, or even with executives at times. What information do we maybe keep under wraps for a period of time, or at times keep under wraps consistently? And what do we share very freely? Or do you see any patterns there?
Yeah, financial information is the one that's the most difficult to share. It's important because you want to share with your team how the business is growing, how things are performing. And the advice I always give, and when I enter into an organization, the things I will always share is something that is indicative of whatever that is, without having to share the actual financial information. So is it number of customers? Is it percentages of growth? Is it how you're segmenting up your business? Like, you don't have to share dollars and cents, but you can share other information that gives people a sense of, oh, okay, like, we're in a growth scenario, or we're not in a growth scenario, or, we're moving into this different line of business. And as a result, we're not investing as much in this particular area of the business, and so on and so forth. So it's figuring out, how not to share the recipe, but sharing enough information about the recipe that people understand what's happening in the business.
Okay, so back to that metaphor, it would be somewhat akin to saying, hey, we're selling more Coke. Hey, our percentages are going up. And you know what? We're reducing some of our sugar content. That doesn't give away the recipe in any way. But what it's doing is saying, hey, we're doing a great job at what we're doing. Continue these things or whatever.
Yeah, and imagine the R&D department at Coke hearing that information, like, oh, okay, like we've got to start reducing sugar. Like now everybody's thinking about what is it that we can do to start reducing sugar content in our cola. And you won't have to start that conversation with everybody and tell them that's what you're doing. You shared it with your organization and everybody's starting to think about it. You will get way more productivity and way more ideas out of folks when you just start telling them what you're up to. I had an experience that started off as a very bad one in a previous role that ended up being excellent. If you're interested in a little story, larger organization, about 400 employees. We were very challenged from a financial perspective by our customers. They were trying to spend less. The economy was not great, and we were being asked to cut prices and do all these things. And so, we took it upon ourselves as a leadership team to start looking at very specific areas where we could make changes into the business. And we started making those changes and ended up talking about some of it at a town hall. And I'll never forget this. We had one employee, a frontline employee, who stood up in the town hall and shared her thoughts in a very unfiltered manner with us, about what we were up to. Right. And, at the end of the town hall, we kind of looked at each other and like, wow, like, vocal person, what do we do with this information? And our decision was to engage that person, irrelevantly in their area, about how we could make changes in the business. And we realized that that person who was outspoken actually had great ideas and was able to help us move the business forward. Right. So it is all about that dialogue. Like the more you're comfortable sharing, the more value you will get out of the folks that are working with you.
Yeah, I tend, being really transparent here, I tend to overshare. I tend to say, hey, if somebody asks me a question, I try to give them as much as possible because I want to help. Like that's a huge driver for me. And I realize sometimes I probably don't have to share as much. I think that as I've grown in business wisdom and experience, I'm starting to go, hey, like do I need to share every idea that's in my head? No. Let's share what we're operating right now, and encourage people that there are plans or whatever. That's a much better process. But I hear what you're saying and going, information, it depends on where we're at and what we struggle with, but information allows our team to come alongside of us and really join what we're doing and give their best effort and their best ideas in what we're doing. And I agree with that completely. Okay, that's good. I really appreciate this, Dave. As always, I'm really enjoying this conversation. What is the third issue or the third thing that founders really need to be careful with or focus on?
And this one's probably the hardest for owners or founders to, I'm going to say process, and um, it's when you take your top trusted individuals in your organization. It's like, okay, I know I can call up Mark and I can have an honest conversation with him about things, and Mark's going to answer questions for me, and he's going to be responsive, and he's going to help me problem solve. And I love that dialogue with Mark. And Mark, by the way, is performing so fantastically for me in this relationship. I couldn't have grown the business without Mark. And then the business grows and they decide to make Mark a manager or make Mark a leader. And, more often than not, that doesn't work because, that relationship, that one-on-one relationship between an owner and an employee, especially a really productive employee, you know, that is a special relationship, right? Those people are responsive to you. They're fantastic individual contributors, but in those processes, it's just you and them. You're not even assessing their ability to be a leader in the organization, but because you trust them, right? You've got these right hand folks that you can rely on to get things done for you. You start to want to give them leadership positions and increasing positions of accountability and authority without ever really assessing if they actually have the ability to do that. Even worse, you're the boss. And so if I say, hey, like today you're my whatever, and now you're my manager of whatever, and along with that comes a compensation increase, like I'm not going to say no to that as a frontline employee. I'm going to be like, fantastic, my career is growing. I'm getting more responsibility. I'm going to have people reporting to me. This is exactly what every business person wants in their career. But nobody's thinking about whether that person is actually qualified to be a leader or not.
So if I could break one paradigm that I hear about happening in business all the time, and I struggle with myself. I'm not saying that I'm immune to this, but if I could break one paradigm among businesses, both owners and employees, it's believing that a new title is a reward. Because what I believe fully, and I mean, you've talked about other people talk Peter Principle and other things, like we raise people to their lowest level of competence, and then it breaks relationships. So we've got this fantastic person. They did exactly what we needed them to do. Like, and legitimately, you're talking about other complex things here, Dave, because you're talking about somebody we want to reward somebody, loyalty and all those things that they're bringing us. They were here from the beginning. There are so many ways to do that without putting somebody in a position that they're not going to do well in, and it's going to cause grief for everyone. I can think of so many examples of this. Maybe can you maybe throw out a couple of examples yourself of situations where you went, this could have been handled a little bit differently, or maybe situations where it did get handled really well and businesses succeeded because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I could think of a ton of examples, and so rather than like pick one specific one, I'll just kind of give some generic situations that I see happening time and time again. So, business grows from whatever to whatever, and they don't really know what to do with people, so they start creating these roles, and you end up creating these roles for your trusted individual, where they're sort of the glue that holds everything together. It's like, all right, well, department A and department B and department C and department D aren't working well together. That's fine. I don't need to worry about that because I've got, Mark, that knows everything, and he can make sure that all those departments are working together, and he becomes the person who's the handler of the information and the coordinator of the work. And that's great until the business either grows beyond, having one Mark, and now you need two or several of them, or even worse, Mark leaves, right? Because now nobody other than Mark knows how to do that particular task. They don't know, other than you, enough about the business on how to tie it all together. So that person leaves, and now all of a sudden, none of these people that are supposed to be working together know how to do it. I see that almost every single time I enter into an organization, regardless of size. right? I mean, this happens at $5 million organizations. This happens at $200 million organizations.
Interesting. So, I mean, having this person that's again has all the information or has all the some maybe history behind it that can put this all together. It's almost like they've created their own position in the company, and now you believe you need that position. What is the solution to that specific problem, Dave? I've got a couple of ideas in my head, but yeah, I want to hear from you because you're the brains behind this conversation.
Brains behind it, sure. I how do you unwind it? That is really difficult, right? Like how you unwind that is, you basically have to go, okay, like, I think I know what that person does every single day. But now I've been far enough away from the front lines of the business or the four divisions that they're working with. Now I have to like relearn how this business is operating today. Cause as an owner, I know how it operates, but I don't know the details of how it operates as it's grown. So now you're, back to not focusing on what your skill is. You're spending time doing things that have absolutely no value to the business, right? You've accidentally ended up in this place where you have somebody who is coordinating all these activities, and now you have to learn what those activities are so you can unwind them, right? Like, so I mean, unwinding it is a messy, difficult, painful process. Way better is preventing it in the first place, and that was just one example, right? So I guess as a general thing, number one, if you've got a fantastic individual contributor in your business and they're excellent at their job and they're a perfect resource and they can get things done to speed along customer acquisition or whatever it is, if you're thinking about giving them an increase in responsibility, like you said, it doesn't have to be a promotion or a new title. And you really have to think about, assessing that person. And there's lots of tools and people out there that can help you do that. Like, does this person have the ability to become a leader in the organization, or are they just a very good individual contributor? And if they're an excellent individual contributor, there's lots of ways you can make them successful in the organization without giving them a title or a promotion or people to report to them.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think that's it comes down to the basics again, right? The basics are, do we have the right people in the right seats? And if we're growing those seats, what seats do we need? I'm thinking about strat planning again. That's the first thing that comes to my mind is how do we do checks and balances to make sure that we are doing this well, especially while we're growing? Is a strat planning session something that you would recommend? What else would you say just as that check and balance to see where we're going or where we're maybe getting this wrong?
Yeah, and always strat planning is good. It doesn't need to be a very sophisticated process. And what's very interesting actually is at the very beginning of businesses, founders, entrepreneurs, owners are very good at that because they've got such a small team. They need to tell the team what they're doing with the business and what their vision is and where they want it to go, and assigning responsibilities and tasks to all these people. It's as the business grows that they stop doing that, right? They stop gathering the team together. They stop asking for the ideas because so many things are happening on a day in, day out basis that they have to deal with. They almost forget that what got them there in the first place was excellent communication and bantering of ideas and sharing of information and asking those what if, like, how can we do this better? What if we did it this way? Like, as the business grows, entrepreneurs for some reason spend less time doing that, and they really need to spend just as much time doing it. And every time I say strat plan to a successful entrepreneur, they roll their eyes, right? They're like, oh, so we've got some formal process that we have to follow, and we're going to sit in a room and talk about all these things. I think the biggest failing about the strat planning exercise is we make it more important than it needs to be. We make it more, I don't even know what to say. Like, we just make it like this big independent thing that has to happen. At the end of the day, what strat planning is it's having a good idea of where you want your business to go and sharing that idea with the people that are going to help you get there and getting their feedback on the idea. Like, that really is the nature of strategic planning or business planning, and I've done these strat planning exercises in businesses that I'm invested in that have like 5 employees, and you're not always going to get all 5 employees in the room because you've got to run the business, but you're going to get at least one or two of your leadership roles or your supervisors or the people that have some skill, and you're going to have that conversation with them for a day or half a day or whatever it is. As businesses grow, it needs to be a bit more formalized. And it needs to be a multi-day exercise. It has to be a bit more thoughtful, but that shouldn't be intimidating to an entrepreneur or CEO. It should be liberating that they have the ability to get their key leadership team without the noise of the business in the background and talk about the business and what it is they're going to do. I always encourage people to do that, regardless of the size of your business.
Well, I think about, again, and maybe I'm just a weirdo, so forgive me, audience, as I think through this, but legitimately for myself, I go every 3 months. I need to revisit my goals and my plan and get refocused, because every 3 months I'm getting unfocused. I know that. I just slowly drift away from the area of focus. That's just this what I do. So I need to come back to that consistently. And if that's the case for me, what is it for other people? And if we can get our entire organization refocused on a consistent basis, I don't see how that's a harm in any way, shape, or form. What are your thoughts on that?
It's not harmful at all. And in fact, just yesterday completed a business planning session with one of my clients. And what we did was we had all these objectives and things we were going to achieve last year. So we sat down and scored ourselves. We said, all right, how well did we honestly do against these things? And, it was the first time a strat plan had been done. It was the first time a formal business plan had been done in a meaningful way that was actionable. And a whole bunch of things changed in the business in the interim. And we started scoring ourselves against these things. And at the end of the day, we ended up with like a 5 or 6 out of 10, right? So if this was a child's report card, we would have given ourselves like a D or a C, which nobody's like overjoyed about. And so we had that conversation, like, why did that happen? And the resonating sentiment was we got distracted, right? We focused on other things and we forgot to come back to this plan, every month, every 3 months, whatever it is, to see how we were doing against that. So we had all these great ideas at the beginning of the year, the things that we wanted to achieve. But by the end of the year, we hadn't closed them all off. Why? Well, it's because we didn't revisit them on a regular enough basis to match our process against it. And so this year's business planning exercise for us is going to be very much focused on, we need to regularly revisit these things we said we were going to do against the timelines we said we were going to do them in. And we need to make sure that they get done. And obviously things change in a business throughout the year, and you're going to have to kind of defer something or delay something, and that's okay. And by the way, I would rank most organizations like a 4 or a 5 out of 10 the first year they do those things. So, I didn't see it as a negative at all.
Yeah. I think sometimes I hear about, again, Japanese organizations with 200-year plans and things like that. The beauty of having, and this goes back to the basics, right? In the end, in order to achieve a goal, we need to know where we're at, we need to know where we're going, and we need a time frame. If we have those three things in our personal lives and relationships, and like, it doesn't matter what the goal is or the area of physical health, mental health, whatever it is, if we know those three things and we can clearly communicate them to others, it means that we've got a good handle of it. And if we cannot communicate those things in simple ways, it means we're treading water, we're lost in some direction, even if we're growing, even if certain things look like they're happening. Would you agree with that?
100%.
Okay.
Because people do forget that element of, there's lots going on in the business that the owner is not necessarily going to be aware of and is not going to have the capacity to make every single decision on. And so at least if you know where the business is supposed to be going and you can just kind of gear every thought towards that, you're often going to make a better decision than if you didn't know what that direction was going to look like. Right. So absolutely, it's critical.
I remember just going to a point that we've gone away from a little bit here, but you talked about kind of the prototypical example of how an organization grows. And there's usually an individual that has all this information and they've got their fingers in like 83 pies. And they become almost so integral to the business that we're scared of them on some level of going, what do we do? Like if we tick this person off, what could they do with it? Like, you know what I mean? And this organization did not have that problem, but I was invited to a strat planning session and was grateful to be part of it. Really cool business. In the process, it's exactly what had happened. So this business had grown significantly, and there was one person that just kept taking on more departments. So they were the head of like like 8 departments, and then there were like 2 other department heads for individual departments. And really what that planning session, one thing that came out of it was, hey, how do we free this individual up? Because it's not about punishment, it's not about like getting rid of somebody or anything like that. Very competent person. How do we free them up to do one of your first points, to do what they're fantastic at? How do we get them to do what they're brilliant at, what their gifts are? Really double down on that, and then put other people in these positions so that it actually thrives, rather than having one person trying to, again, operate 8 different departments. It just didn't make sense, right?
Yep. Yep. And it happens almost every single time, right? I mean, it could be one person, it could be a handful of people, but you can tell when a question gets asked in the room and everybody's head turns to one person for the answer, you're like, okay, I think maybe this person has, a little bit too much control over what goes on in the business. And that's not healthy for a business ever, right? You need trusted individuals. You need to make sure that people feel empowered and they have opportunities to build their career. But the last thing you want is a whole bunch of silos in your business. And even worse, like you mentioned, silos that, are under the control of one person. There's no way that person is performing 8 or 9 completely different, unrelated functions well, right? We all know that. There's got to be 1 or 2 or 3 that they're excellent at. Align them in that direction, bring in experts that can help out with the other things. All of a sudden, things will get a lot easier for you in your business.
Or if they are legitimately good at all those things, they probably need to move on in the organization in some way, right? If they're being underutilized, great, but let them give them some freedom to explore their gifts in a different way. I agree with that completely. Thank you again. Okay, Dave. This is brilliant as always. I learn a ton and I grow every single time I speak with you. I love, again, when you're spending time with just smarter people than you, we grow a lot. So I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I enjoy these conversations, and every time I talk through examples, I think about those individuals and where they went in their career, in their business, and the ones that are able to kind of escalate beyond that level really are truly successful and build sustainable organizations. And so, these conversations re-energize me every single time. So I appreciate it.
Mhm.